All right. Can you hear me? All right, cool. So, that was a lot of trouble, but here we are. So hopefully this will be much less inflammatory than our last one. I think it will be much easier to keep our passions circumscribed, as the saying goes. So, Nintendo 64 is a better console than Xbox One. Now, as far as debates go, obviously this is completely anecdotal and opinion-based, so it will be hard to come to a factual conclusion either way, but I think I can prove my case. Now, from my own experience, I think, I got to close Facebook here because I'm fighting with other people. There we go. Now that's out of the way. I recall from my childhood having much more fun with N64 than I do now with Xbox One. And here are a couple reasons why. First of all, you bought a game off the shelf, brought it home, plugged it in, you got a full gaming experience. You did not need to buy more downloadable content later. You weren't being used as an unpaid beta tester, actually a paying beta tester, excuse me, the way these games are on Xbox One, where they release these patchy, shitty games that you pay for, and then they have to patch it up later, and that just sucks. Furthermore, it sucks that every time you get an Xbox One game, you have to download an update, many, many gigabytes worth. Often takes all night just to, at least for me, to download the game that I bought. You can't just buy the game from the store, bring it home, and play it. There's always a problem. You have to delete stuff off the hard drive to make room for new stuff, and even with it on the hard drive, you still need the CD. It is just such a mess, and I don't ever remember a Nintendo 64 game breaking. I don't remember them just freezing in the middle of the thing and then having to, return the game to GameStop and then have them give me a new disc or anything like that. So overall, the frustration levels I felt with Nintendo 64 were far lower. The enjoyment I felt was far higher, and it felt like they were putting real effort into giving you a full experience. Now every damn game on Xbox One is part of a trilogy, part of a series, so you can never have as much complete fun anymore. So that said, I will pass it over to you.
Sorry, taking notes there. There is a lot of subjectivity to this debate. If we took it from the purely subjective, and going back to our childhoods, I suspect we'd mostly be in agreement. I suspect we're close to the same age range, although you have aged much better owing to your supple amphibian skin. I actually wanted to approach this debate somewhat from an objective standpoint, because we're arguing hardware versus hardware. You know, the things you're saying about the video gaming experience are well taken, but if you were able to remove those barriers, the Nintendo 64 today simply lacks the power to do most of the things that the Xbox One does. Just looking at the central processor unit on the Nintendo 64, it's a 64-bit processor running at 93.75 megahertz and capable of 93.75 megaflops. For those who are not in the computer business, a flop stands for floating point operations per second. You look at just the base processing unit on the Xbox One, it runs. I'm looking for the speed, but the number that really matters to me is that it has an estimated peak power of 1.31 teraflops. That's more than 1,000 times the power, just the sheer base processing power, and we're not even talking about graphics of the Nintendo 64. Your point is taken about how the out-of-box experience is more complete on the Nintendo 64. However, I would point out that many of the games that we enjoyed the most, you couldn't play on the original Nintendo 64 because it did not have enough RAM. If you recall, when Donkey Kong Country came out, that was a really big release. They actually had to release a RAM expansion pack with it because otherwise the game was too complex. It would crash the N64. And a lot of the games after Donkey Kong Country, you couldn't play without that expansion pack either. So the Xbox One is more powerful out of the box, the Nintendo 64 had to be modified midway through its life cycle just to play its own games. I'll let you address the hardware stuff because I'm running low on time, and then I'll get to the software on my next go-around.
Okay, point taken about the more powerful software, rather. I also assume you mean Donkey Kong 64, because if I remember right, Donkey Kong Country was actually a Super Nintendo game, and Donkey Kong 64 was the 64 version. It was an awesome, it was a world-changing game. So I guess the real meat of this debate is whether better, and I guess I could have clarified, means a more powerful machine or a better user experience. Because while you were saying all that, what I was thinking of was a car. So if there's a car that comes out in 1960 that is just a joy to drive, it's quiet, it's smooth, the driver really loves driving it, and then 40 years later in the year 2000, an updated version of that car comes out that's much fancier, it has much nicer paint, much more horsepower, shinier wheels and stuff like that, but breaks down more often, is more likely to get into a crash, the upkeep is more expensive, and I think this happens fairly often, actually. The debate is whether better means newer, fancier, shinier, more powerful, or a preferable user experience. Now, to play online, to play with friends, and this is one of my biggest problems with Xbox One, is that there's no multiplayer option unless you're buying Xbox Live, unless you're paying to play online. N64 had the 4 controllers. You could pop in GoldenEye 64, and months of your life was just gone because you'd have your buddies over, you go to their house, they'd come to your house, and even though the graphics by today's standards were not impressive at all, they just kind of run around with their arm out, the whole body turns at once, but it was a really great time and much less of a pain in the ass to play with your friends than it is to make sure everyone's got Xbox Live Gold or whatever. Then you got to sync up your profiles and all that. And I guess my real problem is that it seems like the video game industry as a whole has moved from, just fun with your friends to money making. And this is something every industry goes through. And not that money wasn't important at the time, because obviously it was. Nintendo wouldn't have been in business unless they were making money. But now it feels like, instead of just being someone they're trying to make fun games for, like I'm just a profit center and they're trying to extract every possible penny they can from me. For me, that kind of ruins my experience. So that said, I would like to hear about your software argument.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our differences of opinion probably come from the way that each of us likes to game. I enjoyed many rounds of GoldenEye with my friends. Many of those also ended with us throwing controllers at each other because we were really filthy players. You could do some really nasty things with proximity mines. But a lot of my gaming these days is either alone or it is against people online. By the way, note for this debate, I don't own an Xbox One. I'm actually part of the PC Master Race, as you can see right over there. And before that, I was a PlayStation guy. But on the point of multiplayer, one of the benefits that I find for the Xbox One that has in common with PC is, in fact, the fact that multiplayer is online, that you don't have to be in person. The reason for that is I have most of my friends that I do play games with live quite far away. In fact, one of them is a missionary in what's it called? Papua, Papua New Guinea there in the Pacific Ocean. Plus, when you talk about playing with friends, today the social gaming experience is often you make friends. You meet people through the online gaming that you wouldn't have met otherwise, and you form teams with people who have different gaming skills as opposed to people you just know in person. So it's kind of a potato situation. Now, as far as the specific games on Xbox One, one disadvantage the Xbox One is at is that it is a newer console. So like you said, a lot of its best games are continuations of existing franchises. But boy, are they great continuations. Fallout 4 is a phenomenal game and far more advanced than its Nintendo 64 era compatriots, which were, of course, on PC. But even in original games, you have game changers like Overwatch, Titanfall, Destiny, and these are also games that are lauded for their multiplayer content. Even though it's online and requires a subscription, it's far deeper. You can get far more hours out of it. than you could out of a Nintendo 64 game. You know, there's only so many times that you can play GoldenEye before you just get tired of the guy playing Odd Job winning every time. But one final point on software for the Xbox One is that in the most recent releases, Xbox One is backwards compatible. So all the games that made the Xbox 360 great, like Elder Scrolls V, Skyrim, or any of those games, you can also play on Xbox One, but at a higher resolution, at 4K resolution. So it's in the Nintendo 64 never had anything like that. You couldn't play Donkey Kong Country on the N64. There was a Game Boy card at one point, but that was about it. So there's what I'd have to say about software.
So that's actually one of my biggest problems with Xbox One is the almost complete lack of backwards compatibility. You would assume that because they both use CDs or DVDs, whatever the actual disc is, you know, I'm not a tech guy, you would assume that all Xbox games you could play, and Xbox 360 games you could play on Xbox One. But in fact, there is a relatively short list of games that work. And a lot of the better games for Xbox and Xbox 360 you can't play on Xbox One. That's a problem because I'm an RPG guy, and there are not a lot of good RPGs out for Xbox One. Actually, the best RPG I ever played was an almost completely unknown game for Nintendo 64 called The Aiden Chronicles, with really crappy graphics, but an amazing story, an amazing fighting system that I wish they would update. The best games for Xbox and Xbox 360 were the Knights of the Old Republic games, as far as RPGs go. And it's insane to me that you can't play those on an Xbox One, or that they haven't made an Xbox One version. As far as what you're saying about the number of hours of enjoyment you can get out of it, I think that's true if you are the collector type who needs to have every item and every collectible. But for someone like me who just is there for like the story and the fighting mostly, you know, it feels like they've padded out their game with a lot of stuff that doesn't actually add any enjoyment to me. Like saying that, you know, if you collect 100 of this thing, you get a special weapon. That's okay in moderation, but a lot of these extra hundreds of hours are what seem to me meandering and useless. Now, another big problem I have with the Xbox One, particularly the multiplayer for games like Mass Effect, which for the record, I'm a big Mass Effect fan. They actually have, in the multiplayer, you can actually spend real money to get better weapons. And I think that's completely unfair to people who don't have a lot of disposable income. Because if someone has, let's say, an extra $1,000 a month to spend on video game weapons, you're going to get crushed just because, I don't know, maybe you have a lower paying job, or you don't feel like spending your disposable income on video game weapons. Maybe you have kids. I don't have kids. I know you do. You know, maybe you have higher priorities than video game weapons. And that seems like it really unlevels the playing field. I don't know if that's a word. It unbalances the playing field to give people the option of more high-powered weapons for more money. Now, if you're a PC person, I think you probably see that all the time. I know there are marketplaces for Warcraft and games like that. But on the Nintendo 64, skill was everything. If you didn't have the skill, you lose. If you do have the skill, you win. And there was really no way to cheat or to mod it in order to get an unfair advantage. And I think that makes a better console too. The playing field was more level.
Okay, I take it you never used the old Game Mark with those cheat codes back for the Nintendo 64. I was never a big fan of that either, but I take your point on PC hacks online. As far as your point about RPGs, I think again we're back to an industry issue because the nature of the RPG has changed. You know, my favorite RPG of the old generation was actually for Super Nintendo was Chrono Trigger. But these days, what they consider an RPG is like the Fallout series, the Elder Scrolls series. Destiny is even considered an RPG. They're much more action-oriented as opposed to story-oriented, and there's not as much turn-based. And this doesn't really help the point with the Xbox One, but I'd recommend to you looking into the PC market because there's so many independent old-style JRPGs out there. One of my friends actually has one out on Steam now. It's called Vidar. That's excellent. So we've got it's basically your beef with the Xbox is a beef with today's gaming industry, and all of which is valid. However, there are things that you can do with the Xbox One that simply weren't possible with the Nintendo 64 that don't cost money. We mentioned, the limited backwards compatibility, but that's actually because of the more powerful technology of the Xbox One, because it doesn't actually have to use a disc in order to run a game. What the backwards compatibility element does is you actually download an Xbox 360 emulator to the Xbox One, and the games that are available for it right now are just ones that have been optimized for the emulator, but more of those could be optimized in the future. And you mentioned modding. Now, the Nintendo 64, it was impossible for someone to take a program that was on a cartridge and add their own tweaks to it, new levels, new items, new characters, new quests. You have a whole world of that now in the modern gaming universe. Entirely new games have been built on top of existing games by users that have kept games that are now 5, 6, 7 years old fresh. Whereas if you go back to a Nintendo 64 game from back in the day, it's the same experience. Even if it's a great experience, it's never going to change, and there's never going to be anything new to it. So what you see as a disadvantage for the Xbox One, I see potentially as an advantage, because it can keep that same library of games fresher because of the social aspect, because of the internet, and because of people out there who are going to program new elements for it.
I think that's fair. I think ultimately it comes down to whether you are more of like a tech-oriented, like you want to see the new stuff, the flashy stuff, and some of that can be really good, don't get me wrong. Like, for example, I have Final Fantasy, I think it's 16. It's probably the best-looking game I've seen on the Xbox One. And supposedly it's an RPG in the Final Fantasy lineage, but it's still just missing something. It feels like because of the updated hardware, more powerful hardware of the Xbox One, and I guess this goes to your point that I'm really complaining about the gaming industry more than the console, but it feels like these companies are spending more money and resources and energy trying to make the game look really cool rather than on the substance. Like, for example, I don't know if you ever had the GameCube, but Super Smash Brothers and Super Smash Bros. Melee, I think it was the GameCube version, that was a game that you could get endless hundreds of hours of fun out of. It didn't need updates. It was just really, like, they designed it to be fun for the user. They didn't design it to be fun for modders. They didn't design it to be able to be updated, even though they did update it later on different platforms, I think. But it just feels to me like the heart is missing these days from the games. And this is actually the same complaint I have for music. I think old music is a lot better than a lot of what we have now. And I think I'm probably much younger than you. I'm only 29 at the moment. But yes, I have aged well, as you can see here. Like, for example, the shirt I'm wearing now, Judas Priest, the guitar solos these guys played back in the day, they had heart and they had soul, and they were brilliant technicians and classically trained musicians and pianists and guitarists. But there was something to them that you listen to metal today, and it's just not there. It's just how fast can you play scales? It's kind of the Yngwie Malmsteen effect of look how fast I can play, but there's no substance to it. It's just flash and glitz. It's more like showing off the power of the machine or the power of the guitar rather than being an expression of the creator, the person creating the art. And so maybe it's just a problem of modernity in general. The same thing happening to video games, happening to music, happening to paintings and architecture too. I mean, it just keeps getting worse and worse, almost to a point where we live in this world now where having actual talent at something is considered unnecessary because it's all open to interpretation, like modern art, which is not art by anyone's standards, really. So maybe my argument is really just that I've been born in the wrong century.
Yeah, I'm 31, but most people do think I'm older than that because, oh, look at me. So I'm glad you brought up the music analogy because I thought let's see if you catch this line, all this machinery making modern music can still be open-hearted. So early on, when the electric guitar came out, there was a lot of novelty in just the distorted sound and not a ton of artistry behind it, or the old 1950s style. Took a while for people to incorporate the new technology into something that had more heart to it. Same with the synthesizer. When those first came out, late 70s, early 80s, people were just kind of making wacky noises with them. It took a while for bands like Rush, Van Halen, Electric Light Orchestra, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, to take those new instruments and incorporate them into real artistry. And now there's sort of a staple that you see with true artist groups like Dream Theater. I may be dating myself a little bit by referencing Dream Theater. I don't know what they're doing these days. And we are sort of at that spot right now in gaming where 4K has come out and the long form cinematic type game is the norm. And there is some of that focus on who can make the game that looks the best or takes the most advantage of the powerful hardware. But just like back in the day, you had to go outside of pop radio to find the people who were making better use of the technology or using older technology to make better music. The same's kind of true for the gaming industry right now. Now, it hasn't come to consoles yet, to my knowledge, but for PC and for the Steam box, whose name I am forgetting right now, there's a wealth of independent gaming out there that is using sometimes a generation or two older technology or sometimes the most modern stuff, but they're making games that have philosophy built into them, explore human emotions and human psyche. My favorite example is the Talos Principle, which may even be available for Xbox One. But you have games like Beyond Two Souls, The Last of Us, that take advantage of the technology, but that do have that heart in it. But you're right in this sense that it's not coming from the big studios. And that was a disadvantage for the Nintendo 64 in the sense that only the big studios could develop those sorts of games. Back then they were incentivized to do so. Now it's just they're disincentivized. But at least now it's possible for independent game makers to get in on the action.
You know, that is a good point. I've had several people recommend PC to me. I just don't have the time at the moment to build a computer, so I don't think I'd want to buy one from the store and start looking through all this stuff. But I think that's also a good point that maybe it's just because the big names in the store from Xbox One are the big name studios. They're the mainstream stuff. It's not the underground stuff that's going to be higher quality but appealing to smaller people. There's actually one series that I know is on PC. It was called Gothic. And then I think it's Piranha Byte Studios or Deep Silver that maybe started doing the Risen series on the Xbox. And those are really great games, but largely unknown from what I can tell as well. It's interesting you mentioned Dream Theater as well because they're awesome. They have a band without the singer called Liquid Tension Experiment that if you really want to see what those guys are capable of when they're not limited by the need for vocals and lyrics, that's pretty good. You're Christian, aren't you? There's a band I just discovered called Theocracy that's like a Jesus-focused version of Dream Theater. They have an 11-minute epic song called I Am that's very much worth checking out. It's really, really amazing. So I think to your last point, though, the Xbox One and N64 would similarly have been hindered by what I just said, by only the big studios can really afford to produce games for it. So maybe the answer to my complaining is just to bite the bullet, sell my Xbox, and get a PC instead. I don't have too much else to say on the topic. I feel like we've really exhausted the gamut here. So I'll pass it back to you to see if there's any other points you want to discuss or what.
Yeah, I think we're out of stuff to debate. We're nowhere near out of stuff to talk about. I built my PC over here. I love doing it as a hobby. So if you want to contact me offline and I'll turn you on to some part shopping and maybe I can put it together for you and ship it to you. But yeah, I think what we ultimately ended up discussing is the old state of the gaming industry and the new state. And the monetization of the user is a real problem. The retail costs of an Xbox game out of the box, if you adjusted it for inflation, are probably more than what you would pay for an Xbox 360 game out of the box now. But then to get the most out of it, you do have to put a lot more money into it. When I bought Fallout 4, I went ahead and bought the season pass because I knew that when the new content came along, it was going to cost at least twice as much as the season pass to get it all. And that's kind of legit because, yeah, the game costs $60 new, but it really, to get the whole game, it costs 120. So that's certainly no good. But all of these things, I think, it would really figure that a debate about the N64 versus the Xbox One would come back to we should all just get PCs, because I think that's where the gaming world is right now. But it was good to kind of get together and have some nostalgia about those great Nintendo 64 games. I still have mine in the living room. I've still got Star Fox 64. I've still got GoldenEye. I still have WWF No Mercy, which is still actually the best wrestling game that's ever been made. Pretty much the only game they never got genre they never got especially right on Nintendo 64 was football, but now that's not any better on Xbox One than it was on Nintendo 64, because the best of those games were PS2 and that generation. So we're kind of at a point where those of us who love games, you can turn to the PC. And by the way, if you're not familiar with them, there are free Nintendo 64 emulators out there, and you can find ROMs, which are computer playable versions of those games, so you can actually play them on your PC with your gaming PC, and it's the same experience. You go to GameStop, you get yourself a generic controller, and you're right back to your childhood, man.
That's a good point. As far as football games on 64, I'm not a fan of regular sports games, but NFL Blitz I had a shitload of fun with. I'd rather be on a field playing real sports unless I can play as like a dragon or a horse or a clown or any of the other options NFL Blitz gave me. I think ultimately it comes down to also to some extent whether you're introverted or extroverted, whether you want to have a game that you can just play by yourself, or whether you want to have a game. Games for Xbox One now are designed mostly to be multiplayer games. They're not really designed with people like me in mind, where you're just going to sit there and play in your room. There are some, but it seems like the trend of the industry is connected. It's the Facebook world. It's the social media world. And I appreciate your offer on the PC. I might hit you up on that in a few months when I have some extra time and cash to throw around. So that said, thank you for the debate. I expected that this would go more calmly than the last one, and I'm glad to see I was right. So thank you for your time. I apologize again for not being able to log into the website for so long. I don't know what that was all about. But let's see what the votes say about N64 versus Xbox One, and I will see you some other time.